Welcome to another edition of the West Tokyo JALT podcast series. As usual, you're joined by two hosts, which would be myself, Jason Pratt, and Andrew O'Brien. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, it's good to be here.
And today's special guest is Dr. Andy Boon, who is coming to us from Toyo Gakuen University. He spoke at our event today on extensive reading, which is a subject that he's quite well known for and quite involved in creating students of extensive reading, experts in the field, and readers themselves. So thank you for joining us, Andy.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're lucky that even though we've got two people that go by Andy, one generally uses Andrew and has an American accent, and one usually uses the name Andy and has a British accent. So it should be fairly easy to distinguish between the two, I hope. If you get confused, send me an email afterwards and I'll help sort that out. So could you start, Andy, by telling us briefly what you talked about today?
Yeah, I talked about what extensive reading is, and I talked about my experiences of doing it. So I talked about an extensive reading course that I used to teach at university, where the whole course was basically extensive reading. Then I talked about how to supplement an intensive reading course using extensive reading. And then finally I talked about the readers that I've written and some tips if you were interested in writing graded readers.
If I can ask a little follow-up question about the extensive reading course that you taught. Mm-hmm. Is this a type of course that you would think is pretty beneficial to run, or maybe even integral to a positive English program at any school?
I think it could be done at any school. I think running an extensive reading course per se is a little bit quirky, because the most usual thing in Japan is that it would be to supplement an intensive reading course. I think that's more the norm.
Sure.
So I think a whole extensive reading course was a little bit unusual. I was happy to be given the opportunity to do it, but I think probably the norm at any institution would be as a supplementary.
Typically, when you talk, of course, you're talking from the standpoint of a university instructor.
That's right.
How about in primary school type of levels to up to high school? Would it be something that could be implemented, extensive reading program?
Yeah, it could. I mean, time could be given in class for students to read, or it could be done as a homework task to encourage students to do reading outside, as long as they can have access to the material, which could be quite problematic. Whether institutions are going to ask students to purchase the material or going to provide the material, that's up to the institution. I know some of my readers have been used for the summer reading at high schools, junior high schools, where there's one class set bought for the class or the school itself, and they're given summer reading homework.
Great. How about in terms of an eikaiwa teacher who, of course, knows the value of having a more rounded study program for their students, but the students themselves come because it's a conversation-based school, perhaps. How would you recommend them to convince students of the value?
I think maybe for eikaiwas, one idea would be, you wouldn't be using it in class, but what you could do is encourage the institution to have a library where students could check out the books as part of the perks of being a student at the eikaiwa. And then maybe they could have activities in class where students talk about the books they've read, and that would be the eikaiwa approach. But one would have to convince the institution to finance with the material.
Yeah, but that's a very practical idea. Thank you. Andrew, do you have any follow-up questions from the presentation?
Actually, I have two questions. The first question is, what challenge do you feel that teachers, professors who are a bit skeptical, what challenges do you think that they face, and what advice would you give them to get started or make progress?
I think one of the challenges is, as one of the participants today asked, what is the value of extensive reading, and not maybe seeing it in terms of, well, how can it help my students to develop? I want some quantifiable evidence that this works. And for me, that seems to be against pure extensive reading where students are reading for pleasure, but we do have to assess them. So I think it's finding the balance between assessing students but giving them the enjoyment to read, and also trying to convince people of the value. I know as an educator, it took me a lot to be able to say, okay, I'm going to dedicate 40 minutes of my class time for sustained silent reading, but hey, I'm not doing anything. And that can be perceived from both of the outside and the educator, him or herself, as, well, what am I trying to do here? So the way I overcame that is, as I said during the presentation, is I read the readers to act as a model. And especially if you're looking at Japanese teachers, if they read the readers so that they can talk to their students about the readers and what they're about, or make recommendations, they're acting as model readers, which is very important, I think.
I see. Thank you. And then my last question, if you were going to do a follow-up session to today's,
Yes.
what would you do?
That's a good question. I think maybe there was a question about the readers and the length of readers and the different styles of readers. I think it might be good to bring in a selection of readers and have people look at the readers and think about how they could use them in their class. Because today I talked about the concept and how I've approached it, but I didn't bring in any physical readers. So one of the questions at the end was, how many pages is a reader, or what did they look like?
Right.
So I think if I were to do another session, it would be to bring in readers, because, of course, when I didn't know much about extensive reading, I went to Kinokuniya and hang out in the graded reader area and went through them to see the different styles. Some have pictures, some are manga-like, and some are just text. So to be able to appreciate the different readers, I think bring in a selection. And maybe this is where you could invite Paul Goldberg to do a session, a commercial session on X-reading, and maybe he could show the platform. And if teachers were given the opportunity to access and download or look at the actual readers themselves.
Yeah, like a trial.
Like a trial. And then, you know, it could be much more workshop where how would you use readers in your class once you've seen them.
Okay, Paul Goldberg, you've been name dropped in our podcast series. It's a challenge for you to respond to this somehow.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess one question that's kind of interesting, perhaps follow up on this, would be, since a large portion of our listeners, of course, will be non-Japanese teachers, are you aware of any kind of Japanese graded reader system?
In terms of books in Japanese.
In Japanese, that
there are some.
Okay.
If you head down to Kinokuniya, it's still open on the south exit of Shinjuku Station. If you go to the Japanese language section, where you get Japanese for busy people or the textbooks, you'll find some Japanese readers there.
Excellent. So maybe teachers who want to go through the same experience that their students are going through could do that with Japanese.
Absolutely.
And then better understand how to support, perhaps.
There aren't so many.
Yeah.
But
Okay, business chance if you want to write them.
yeah.
You can have that free business chance given to all listeners of this podcast.
I've actually done this series before.
Oh, have you?
There's a series by Aruku,
Right.
and I went through the process. I went through the first 4 levels, and I can tell you that made a huge difference between what I was perceiving my students were going through and my ability to relate to the students and then talk them through their own experiences.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
So how about your motivation once you finished the book? Did you feel, wow, I've read this book in another language?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And in
Yeah.
fact, because these books were written in Japanese and they were often about Japanese topics,
Right.
a range from cultural things to popular things, historical things. It gave me more confidence in my knowledge about society and gave me more food for conversation to be able to talk with people.
Right.
And then in turn, I would go back and reread them, and my fluency dramatically improved.
Wonderful.
Which then the vocabulary that I had picked up, the structures that I got used to, ended up starting to come through in my own speech.
Right.
So that was a great experience.
And for kanji recognition, do they have kanji in there?
Yeah, although for me, I'm a bit afraid of kanji.
Right,
So
Right. Okay.
Inspiration for another horror story, the killer kanji. Okay, so we try to keep these podcasts to around 10 minutes, and we've reached about that point now. So in closing, Andy, is there anything that you'd like to plug in terms of upcoming projects you're working upon or presentations you'll be giving?
I'm currently working for a new company called Halico, which is HALICO, if you do a Google search for them. And
I'll put a link to them in
yeah.
description.
There are 10 business readers that will be coming out. They should be coming out very, very soon. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are very few, if not any, business.
Nothing I've come across.
Yeah. So not only for students of business English or people who are working, but even for university or high school students, they will provide, they're fun, they're fiction, and they will provide an insight into what life might be like after they graduate, and also picking up useful terms for business English. And then I'm working on a new series that should be coming out next year, or at the end of this year, which will be looking at critical thinking skills for young learners. Young, when I say young learners, junior high, high school,
Sure.
or even university again, and skills that you would need in life.
Excellent. Great. So hopefully our listeners will check those out. And as I said, there's going to be a link in the description of the video, so you can just click upon that and see what Andy was talking about. So I'd like to thank you very much, Andy, for joining us both in the presentation today and on our podcast. And Andrew, thanks for co-hosting with me again.
Thank you. It's been great.
Okay. So we look forward to seeing people in our upcoming events. Thank you for listening.